"Play that piano now," shouted the millionaire at the maid, trying to humiliate her. But when she started playing, everyone was shocked. But before we start this story, tell me, where are you watching from? Leave it in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. Now let's get into the story. The Steinway Model D grand piano gleamed under the crystal chandelier, its ebony surface reflecting the opulent Manhattan penthouse like a dark mirror. Jessica Martinez moved around it with practiced silence, her microfiber cloth catching every speck of dust on the instrument that had remained untouched for 3 years, the exact duration of her employment as Christopher Anderson's housekeeper. At 26, Jessica had perfected the art of invisibility. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a modest bun, her grey uniform pressed to perfection, her movements efficient and soundless. To Christopher Anderson, CEO of Anderson Financial Holdings, she was simply part of the furniture, reliable, unremarkable, replaceable. "The Yamaguchi reception is tomorrow night," Christopher announced, without looking up from his phone as he strode through the living room. His voice carried the entitled confidence of a man who had never been told no. 200 guests. Everything must be flawless. "Yes, Mr. Anderson," Jessica replied softly, her fingers unconsciously tracing the piano's fallboard. Beneath her calm exterior, something stirred, a familiar ache that had lived in her chest for 3 long years. Christopher paused, his steel-grey eyes finally acknowledging her presence. "And Jessica, I'll need you to serve during dinner. The Rothschild account will be there." She nodded, swallowing the bitter taste of another evening spent invisible among Manhattan's elite, watching them discuss millions while she served wine worth more than her monthly salary. As Christopher disappeared into his study, Jessica's hand lingered on the piano keys through the closed lid. If only they knew that the woman polishing their plates had once made Carnegie Hall weep. But tonight, she was just the help. And tomorrow night would be no different, or so she thought. 24 hours later, Jessica stood in Christopher's study, her heart hammering against her ribs as he closed the door behind her. The party preparations were complete downstairs, crystal gleaming, flowers arranged, caterers in position. But something in Christopher's predatory smile told her this wasn't about wine glasses or table settings. "Sit down, Jessica." His tone was different tonight, sharper, more dangerous. She remained standing. "Is there a problem with the arrangements, sir?" Christopher walked to his desk, picked up a manila folder, and let it fall open. Jessica's breath caught. Staring back at her was a photograph from the Manhattan School of Music website circa 5 years ago. A younger version of herself in an evening gown, hands poised over piano keys, the caption reading, "Jessica Martinez, graduate recital, summa cum laude." "Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" Christopher's voice was silk over steel. "Jessica Elena Martinez, daughter of Miguel and Rosa Martinez of Birmingham, Alabama, full scholarship recipient. Master's degree in piano performance, winner of the Steinway competition 2018. Jessica's knees threatened to buckle, but she forced herself to remain upright. "That was a long time ago. 3 years. 3 years you've been in my home, polishing my piano while hiding the fact that you're probably more qualified to play it than anyone I know." He circled her like a predator. "Tell me, what does a concert pianist do to end up scrubbing toilets?" The words hit like physical blows. Jessica's hands clenched at her sides. "I needed work." "Oh, you needed work, and now, Jessica, I need something from you." Christopher moved to the window, gazing down at the glittering city. "Tonight, you're going to play for my guests. Chopin, Bach, whatever impresses rich people. You'll wear your uniform, of course. Wouldn't want anyone confused about your real position here." "I can't." "You can, and you will." He turned, his smile razor-sharp. "Unless, of course, you'd prefer to find new employment. I wonder how many references you'll get after I explain why I had to let you go. Deception in the workplace is so disappointing." Jessica felt the walls closing in. No job meant no rent for her tiny studio apartment. No rent meant homelessness in a city that devoured the vulnerable. She thought of her parents' sacrifice, their dreams dying with them on a rain-slicked Alabama highway, and felt something crack inside her chest. "How long do I have to decide?" Christopher checked his Rolex. "Guests arrive in 2 hours. I'd suggest you start practicing." As Jessica stumbled from the study, one thought blazed through her mind. Tonight, whether she wanted it or not, the music would decide her fate. In her cramped quarters behind the kitchen, Jessica sat on her narrow bed, hands trembling as she stared at her reflection in the small mirror. The grey uniform stared back, a shroud over everything she used to be. Her mind drifted to Birmingham, to a shabby duplex where her father Miguel had worked 3 jobs to afford her piano lessons. She could still see her mother Rosa's calloused hands from the textile factory, still hear her father's broken English as he told the music teacher, "Whatever it costs, she learns music is her future." They had believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself. When the other kids mocked her second-hand clothes and thick accent, the piano had been her refuge. When the scholarship letter from Manhattan School of Music arrived, her parents had cried for 3 hours straight. "Mija," her mother had whispered through tears, "you will do what we never could. You will make beautiful things." The car accident had happened 2 weeks before graduation. A drunk driver, a rainy night, and suddenly Jessica was alone in the world with nothing but student debt and a degree in a field that demanded connections she didn't have. The funeral had taken her last savings. The job search had been brutal. Every audition required money for travel, for accompanists, for sheet music. The rejection letters piled up until Jessica realized the horrible truth. Talent without privilege was just another dream deferred. So she'd taken the first job she could find, cleaning houses for rich people who saw her as invisible, disposable. She'd told herself it was temporary, just until she could save enough to audition again. 3 years later, she was still waiting. A knock on her door jarred her back to reality. "Ms. Martinez," one of the caterers peered in. "Mr. Anderson wants you upstairs. The guests are arriving." Jessica stood, smoothing her uniform one last time. Tonight, she would play again. Not as Jessica Martinez, concert pianist, but as the help performing for her betters. But the music would be real. And perhaps that would be enough to remember who she used to be. The penthouse had transformed into a glittering stage for Manhattan's power elite. Jessica moved through the crowd like a ghost, refilling champagne glasses and dodging conversations about stock portfolios and yacht purchases. 200 of the wealthiest people in New York mingled in Christopher's living room, their combined net worth enough to fund a small country. "Darling, where did Christopher find this wine?" Margaret Rothschild's voice cut through the ambient chatter. "It's divine. Probably cost more than my assistant's yearly salary," her husband replied with a laugh that grated against Jessica's nerves. As she worked, Jessica caught fragments of conversation that painted a picture of casual cruelty, hostile corporate takeovers, environmental regulations dismissed as inconvenient, and workers laid off to boost quarterly profits. These people held the power to change lives, but seemed only interested in accumulating more wealth. Near the piano, she overheard Sarah Williams, the renowned music critic from the New York Times, discussing the Lincoln Center's upcoming season with Dr. Anthony Miller, the Metropolitan Opera's artistic director. "The talent pool is so diluted these days," Sarah was saying. "Real artistry has been replaced by Instagram followers and trust fund portfolios. I haven't heard a truly moving performance in months." "The conservatories are producing technicians, not artists, Doctor," Miller agreed. "They lack soul authenticity. They've never suffered for their art." Jessica's grip tightened on her serving tray. If only they knew that suffering stood right beside them, invisible in a grey uniform. Christopher appeared at her elbow, his hand possessive on her shoulder. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice cutting through the din, "if I could have your attention, please." The room fell silent. 200 pairs of eyes turned toward them, and Jessica felt the weight of their collective judgment. Her chest constricted, making it hard to breathe. "Tonight, we have a special surprise," Christopher continued, his smile never reaching his eyes. "My housekeeper, Jessica, has agreed to provide some musical entertainment. She has some background in piano." A ripple of amused murmurs swept through the crowd. Jessica heard someone whisper, "How charmingly theatrical," and wanted to disappear into the floor. Jessica studied at— "Where was it, dear?" Christopher's tone was mockingly gentle. "Some music school. She'll be playing for us shortly." The crowd parted as Jessica walked toward the piano, her legs feeling like lead. Behind her, she heard the whispered comments. "How delightfully eccentric. Christopher always did have a flair for the dramatic. And worst of all, I hope she knows more than chopsticks." As she reached the Steinway, Jessica's hands shook. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. Not like this, not as a sideshow for people who saw her as entertainment. But the piano waited, silent and patient, the same way it had waited in her parents' living room all those years ago. Taking a deep breath, Jessica lifted the fullboard and placed her fingers on the keys. The room held its breath, waiting to be amused. They had no idea what was about to hit them. The Steinway's keys felt familiar beneath Jessica's fingertips, despite 3 years of silence. The ivory was cool and welcoming, and for a moment, the hostile crowd faded away. She was 8 years old again, discovering that her small hands could create something beautiful from nothing. She began with Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, Opus 9 number 2, the piece her mother had loved most. The opening melody floated through the room like a whispered prayer, each note precise and achingly beautiful. Jessica's technique was flawless, but more than that, the music carried weight. The kind of emotional depth that couldn't be taught, only lived. The chatter died instantly. Champagne glasses paused halfway to lips. 200 people accustomed to commanding attention found themselves utterly captivated by the small woman in the grey uniform who had suddenly become the most powerful person in the room. Sarah Williams' critical eye widened as she recognized what she was hearing, not just technical proficiency, but artistry of the highest caliber. Dr. Miller leaned forward, his conversation forgotten. This wasn't the mechanical performance of a conservatory graduate. This was music with a soul. Christopher's satisfied smirk began to falter as he realized the crowd's reaction wasn't what he'd expected. They weren't amused by his exotic entertainment. They were moved, deeply and genuinely moved. Jessica transitioned seamlessly into Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, her fingers dancing across the keys with impossible grace. The piece was technically demanding, requiring both delicate touch and thunderous power, and she delivered both with stunning precision. But it was the emotion that truly caught the audience. Years of suppressed grief and dreams deferred, poured through every phrase. Margaret Rothschild found tears streaming down her carefully made-up face. Robert Davis, a hedge fund manager known for his ruthless business practices, felt something crack open in his chest as the music washed over him. Even the servers had stopped working, drawn into the spell Jessica was weaving. As the ballade reached its climactic conclusion, Jessica's hands flew across the keyboard with passionate intensity. This was her pain, her parents' sacrifice, her 3 years of silence finally given voice. The music filled every corner of the vast room, demanding attention, commanding respect. When the final chord rang out, the silence was deafening. For a moment, no one moved. 200 of Manhattan's most powerful people sat transfixed, staring at the woman they had dismissed as mere help just minutes before. Then Sarah Williams began to clap, slowly at first, then with building intensity. Dr. Miller joined her, then Robert Davis, then Margaret Rothschild. Within seconds, the entire room erupted in thunderous applause that seemed to shake the crystal chandelier overhead. But Jessica wasn't finished. Not yet. She had one more piece to play, something no one in this room had ever heard before. As the applause died down, Jessica remained seated at the piano, her hands resting on the keys. The room buzzed with excited whispers, but she barely heard them. For the first time in 3 years, she felt truly alive. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said quietly, her voice carrying despite its softness, "I'd like to play something I wrote. Here it's called Renacimiento, Rebirth." Christopher stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Jessica, I think that's quite enough. Let her play." The voice belonged to Dr. Elena Vasquez, director of the Lincoln Center. Jessica hadn't even realized she was there. "Please, continue." The composition began softly, almost tentatively, the musical equivalent of morning light creeping across a darkened room. Jessica had written it during her darkest moments, when the weight of her parents' death and her shattered dreams threatened to crush her completely. But as the piece developed, it became something else, a testament to survival, to the stubborn refusal to let circumstances define you. The first movement, Despair, painted a sonic landscape of loss and grief. Jessica's left hand created a dark, repetitive bass line that represented the endless cycle of poverty and discrimination, while her right hand wove delicate melodies that struggled to break free, her dreams fighting against reality. In the second movement, Endurance, the music shifted. The left hand's oppressive rhythm began to transform, becoming not a prison but a foundation. The melodies grew stronger, more insistent, finding ways to soar above the darkness without abandoning it entirely. Sarah Williams leaned forward, her critical mind racing. This wasn't just exceptional playing, this was exceptional composition. The harmonic language was sophisticated yet accessible, the emotional architecture devastatingly effective. She was witnessing the emergence of a major artistic voice. The third movement, Recognition, brought tears to many eyes as Jessica channeled the moment she first sat at this very piano 3 years ago, seeing in its pristine surface a reflection of her abandoned dreams. The music swelled with bitter sweetness, beauty preserved but unused, potential trapped behind circumstances. But it was the final movement, Liberation, that brought the crowd to their feet. The music erupted with joy and defiance, all the pain and struggle transformed into something transcendent. Jessica's hands flew across the keys with abandon, pouring 3 years of silence into a celebration of artistic resurrection. When the final chord faded, the silence was profound. Then Dr. Vasquez stood, followed by Sarah Williams, then the entire room. The ovation was thunderous, sustained and genuine. Not the polite applause of social obligation, but the raw appreciation of people who had witnessed something extraordinary. Christopher stood frozen, watching his carefully planned evening spiral completely out of control. His guests weren't looking at him anymore, they were looking at her. The help had become the star, and he had become irrelevant. As the applause continued, Jessica felt something she hadn't experienced in years, hope, but she had no idea that the real revelation was just beginning. As the ovation finally subsided, Sarah Williams approached the piano with the determined stride of someone accustomed to pursuing exceptional talent. Her critical eye, the same one that had launched careers and ended pretensions, was bright with excitement. "My dear," she said, her voice carrying the authority of decades in classical music journalism, "where on earth have you been hiding?" Before Jessica could respond, Dr. Anthony Miller was beside her, his face animated with possibilities. "That composition, Renacimiento, it's extraordinary. Have you written others?" Yes, several," Jessica managed, still reeling from the performance and its reception. "This is unconscionable," declared Dr. Elena Vasquez, her voice cutting through the growing crowd around the piano. "Ms. Martinez, did I understand correctly that you're employed here as domestic help?" Christopher pushed through the gathering admirers, his face a mask of controlled fury. "Jessica has been in my employment for 3 years, yes. She's been quite satisfied with the arrangement." "Satisfied?" Margaret Rothschild's voice dripped with disbelief. "A pianist of this caliber cleaning houses? Christopher, surely you must see the absurdity." "What I see," Christopher interrupted, his voice tight, "is that my employee has her duties to attend to. This was merely a brief entertainment." The room fell silent, the tension suddenly palpable. 200 witnesses watched as the evening's dynamic shifted from artistic revelation to something far more uncomfortable, a public examination of exploitation. Sarah Williams stepped closer to Christopher, her journalist's instincts fully engaged. "Mr. Anderson, are you saying you've employed a graduate of Manhattan School of Music, a pianist of obvious international caliber, as your housekeeper for 3 years?" "I employ the best people available," Christopher replied stiffly. "Available for what?" Dr. Miller's voice was dangerously quiet. "Scrubbing floors or performing Chopin?" Jessica felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. These people, powerful, influential, respected, were challenging Christopher Anderson on her behalf. It was surreal, intoxicating, and terrifying all at once. "Perhaps," Dr. Vasquez interjected, her tone diplomatic but firm, "we should discuss Ms. Martinez's obvious talents and potential career opportunities. Sarah, didn't you mention last week that you were looking for emerging artists to feature?" "I did indeed." Sarah's eyes never left Christopher's face. "Ms. Martinez, would you be interested in discussing a feature article for the Times? And perhaps we could arrange for you to audition with some of the city's premier orchestras?" Christopher's mask finally slipped. "Now, see here. Jessica has contractual obligations." "To clean your house," Robert Davis interrupted, his hedge fund manager's instincts recognizing a power play when he saw one. not to sacrifice her artistic career for your convenience. The crowd murmured agreement, their sympathy clearly with Jessica. Christopher found himself facing something he'd never experienced. 200 of his peers united against him in judgment. Jessica stood slowly, her legs still shaky from the performance and its aftermath. For 3 years, she had accepted her invisible status, convinced herself that survival was enough. But now, surrounded by people who saw her talent and recognized its value, she felt something long dormant stirring to life. "Mr. Anderson," she said quietly, her voice carrying to every corner of the room, "I think we need to talk." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and everyone present understood that they were witnessing more than the end of an evening's entertainment. They were watching the end of one life and the beginning of another. In the heavy silence that followed Jessica's declaration, Christopher's face cycled through emotions like a broken kaleidoscope: surprise, anger, embarrassment, and something that might have been fear. He was accustomed to controlling every variable in his world, but this woman he'd relegated to invisible servitude had just upended 3 years of careful manipulation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Christopher said, forcing his society smile back into place, "I think perhaps we should return to dinner. Jessica has other duties." "No." The word came out stronger than Jessica had intended, cutting through Christopher's dismissal like a blade. "I don't." Dr. Vasquez stepped closer, her presence lending Jessica strength. "Ms. Martinez, what exactly are your working conditions here?" Jessica looked around the room at faces that had regarded her as furniture just an hour before, now watching her with genuine concern and interest. The absurdity of it, that it had taken a public performance to make her visible as a human being, should have been amusing. Instead, it was devastating. "I work 7 days a week," she began, her voice gaining confidence. 12-hour days, no vacation time, no sick leave. When Mr. Anderson entertains, I work until the last guest leaves, regardless of the hour. "And your salary?" Sarah Williams's journalistic instincts were fully engaged now. Jessica hesitated, then named a figure that caused several gasps from the crowd. It was barely above minimum wage, an insulting amount for the woman who had just demonstrated artistic ability worth millions. Margaret Rothschild's face flushed with indignation. "That's exploitation, plain and simple." "It's a legal employment arrangement," Christopher snapped, his composure finally cracking. If Jessica was dissatisfied with the terms, she was free to seek employment elsewhere. "Free?" Dr. Miller's voice was incredulous. "With no time to audition, no resources to travel, no opportunity to practice. You've essentially held her artistic career hostage." The accusation hung in the air like an indictment. Jessica felt 3 years of suppressed anger rising in her chest, mixing with the adrenaline from her performance to create something she hadn't felt in years: righteous fury. "You knew," she said, turning to face Christopher directly. "From the beginning, you knew exactly who I was, what I could do, and you used it against me. I provided you with employment when no one else would. You provided me with a cage." Jessica's voice was steady now, each word precisely chosen. "You dangled the threat of unemployment over my head every time I showed any sign of independence. You made sure I was too exhausted to practice, too isolated to network, too desperate to leave." The room was absolutely silent now. 200 witnesses to this public trial of Christopher's character. He looked around desperately for support, but found none. His carefully curated image of benevolent success was crumbling in real time. Sarah Williams stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of the nation's most respected classical music critic. "Ms. Martinez, I'd like to offer you an interview for next Sunday's arts section. The headline will be 'Hidden Genius, the Pianist Manhattan Forgot.' Are you interested?" Before Jessica could respond, Dr. Vasquez spoke up. "And I'd like to discuss guest soloist opportunities with the New York Philharmonic. We have an opening in our spring season. The Met is always looking for collaborative pianists," Dr. Miller added. "Your compositional skills alone would be invaluable." Jessica felt the walls of her 3-year prison dissolving around her. These people, strangers an hour ago, were offering her everything she'd dreamed of, everything Christopher had convinced her was impossible. "Well, Jessica?" Christopher's voice was bitter, defeated. "It seems you have some decisions to make." She turned to face him one last time, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time since she'd started working for him. He wasn't powerful or intimidating. He was a small, frightened man who had built his sense of superiority on the subjugation of others. "I do," she said simply. "And I've made them." With that, Jessica Martinez, concert pianist, walked away from Jessica Martinez, invisible housekeeper, and never looked back. Dawn broke over Manhattan with crystalline clarity, painting the city in shades of gold and possibility. Jessica sat in her tiny studio apartment, still in her grey uniform, staring at the business cards scattered across her kitchen table like promises of a different future. Sarah Williams, New York Times; Dr. Elena Vasquez, Lincoln Center; Dr. Anthony Miller, Metropolitan Opera; Robert Davis, with a handwritten note about arts patronage opportunities. The cards seemed almost too good to be real, artifacts from a dream she was afraid to trust. Her phone had been ringing since 6 a.m., messages from strangers who had somehow gotten her number, offers she couldn't quite process, opportunities that 3 days ago would have seemed like fantasy. The performance had been recorded on someone's phone and was already making rounds on social media with hashtags like Hidden Genius and Justicia for Jessica. The knock on her door came at exactly 9 a.m. Jessica opened it to find Christopher Anderson, looking haggard and older than his 45 years. He was dressed in yesterday's tuxedo, suggesting he hadn't slept either. "May I come in?" Jessica stepped aside wordlessly, gesturing to her small living room with its second-hand furniture and upright piano squeezed into the corner. The only valuable thing she owned, a graduation gift from her parents that she'd somehow managed to keep through 3 years of financial desperation. Christopher looked around the sparse apartment, perhaps seeing for the first time how his employee actually lived. When his gaze fell on the piano covered with sheet music, her compositions, she realized with a start, his expression grew complicated. "You've been writing music all this time," he said quietly. "It's what I do, what I am." Jessica's voice was steady, though her heart was racing. "It's what you tried to take away from me." Christopher moved to the window, looking out at the city that had witnessed both his triumph and humiliation in the span of 12 hours. "I could fire you," he said finally. "You could, but you won't." "Why not?" Jessica almost smiled. "Because firing me now would look like retaliation for last night, and you care too much about your reputation to survive that kind of scrutiny. Sarah Williams is very influential, and she's already interested in my story." Christopher turned back to her, and Jessica was surprised to see something like admiration in his eyes. "You've thought this through." "I've had 3 years to think it through. I just never had the leverage before. And now you do. Now I do." They stood in silence for a long moment, the morning light streaming between them like a bridge over 3 years of carefully maintained inequality. "What do you want?" Christopher asked finally. Jessica had expected this question, had prepared for it through the sleepless night. A recommendation letter, honest and glowing. References for any position I pursue, and compensation for the 3 years you underpaid me. The difference between what you paid and what the market rate should have been for my qualifications. That's all? That's everything. Christopher nodded slowly. And in return? I disappear from your life quietly. No interviews about working conditions, no social media campaigns about exploitation. Your reputation remains intact. Very generous considering. Jessica met his gaze directly. I'm not interested in revenge, Mr. Anderson. I'm interested in moving forward. Christopher pulled out his phone, made a call that was brief and businesslike. My accountant will have a check ready by noon, he said when he hung up. The letter will be on my letterhead, signed and notarized by end of business today. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Christopher moved toward the door, then paused. Jessica, last night, what you played, it was extraordinary. I know, she said simply. Why didn't you ever tell me? Why hide it? Jessica considered the question, then gave him the only honest answer she had. Because you never asked who I was. You only cared what I could do for you. After he left, Jessica sat at her piano and began to play, softly so as not to wake the neighbors, but with a freedom she hadn't felt in years. The music that emerged was new, born from the ashes of last night's revelation, carrying notes of hope she'd forgotten how to hear. Outside her window, Manhattan hummed with its usual energy, but Jessica felt as though she was hearing it for the first time. The city that had nearly broken her was about to become the stage for her rebirth, and this time she would be ready. The backstage area of Carnegie Hall buzzed with pre-performance energy, a familiar symphony of last-minute preparations that Jessica had missed more than she'd realized. Violinists rosined their bows, brass players ran warm-up scales, and throughout it all, the electric anticipation of music about to be born filled the air like incense. Jessica stood before her dressing room mirror, adjusting the deep blue evening gown that had replaced her grey uniform as surely as confidence had replaced desperation. 6 months of intensive rehabilitation, not of her technique, which had remained pristine despite years of neglect, but of her courage, had led to this moment, her debut as guest soloist with the New York Philharmonic. 5 minutes, Ms. Martinez, the stage manager called softly. Through the mirror, Jessica could see the flowers that had arrived throughout the day. Roses from Dr. Vasquez at Lincoln Center, lilies from Sarah Williams at the Times, and most surprisingly, white orchids with a simple card, "Break a leg. You deserve this. C.A." The interview with Sarah had run 3 weeks ago, a thoughtful piece that focused on Jessica's artistry rather than her exploitation, though the subtext was clear enough to anyone who read between the lines. The headline, "Phoenix Rising, The Return of Jessica Martinez," had generated exactly the kind of attention Jessica needed to rebuild her career. The audition process had been surreal, walking into rehearsal halls where she was expected, welcomed, respected. Orchestral musicians, notoriously difficult to impress, had responded to her playing with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for established international soloists. Word had spread quickly through New York's tight-knit classical community. There was a new artist worth watching. "Ms. Martinez?" A young usher appeared at her door. "There's someone here to see you. Says she's family?" Jessica's heart leaped. Through the doorway walked Helen Martinez, her father's sister, who had driven from Birmingham to witness her niece's resurrection. At 62, Helen carried herself with the dignity of a woman who had raised 3 children on a nurse's salary, and her presence was exactly the grounding Jessica needed. "Mija," Helen whispered, pulling Jessica into a fierce embrace. "Your papa and mama, they would be so proud." "I hope so," Jessica murmured against her aunt's shoulder, feeling 6 months of careful composure threaten to crack. "No hoping, knowing." Helen pulled back, studying Jessica's face with knowing eyes. "You look like yourself again. I was worried when you called last Christmas that maybe that man had broken something inside you that couldn't be fixed." "He tried," Jessica admitted, "but the music wouldn't let him." A knock interrupted them. Dr. Elena Vasquez peering around the door with a warm smile. "Sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to wish you luck before curtain. The house is packed, by the way. Critics from 5 papers, representatives from Deutsche Grammophon and Sony Classical, and about half the musical establishment of New York. No pressure." Jessica laughed, a sound that would have been impossible 6 months ago. "Thank you for everything. If you hadn't spoken up that night, you would have found another way," Dr. Vasquez said firmly. "Talent like yours doesn't stay hidden forever. I just helped speed up the inevitable." 2 minutes, came the call from the hallway. Jessica took one last look in the mirror, seeing not the frightened housekeeper who had been forced to perform, but the artist who had chosen to rise. The transformation was complete, but it had taken more than new clothes and opportunities. It had required her to remember who she had been before circumstances convinced her she was less than she was. As she walked toward the stage, Helen's voice followed her. "Make them remember, Mija. Make them remember why music matters." The stage lights were brilliant, the Steinway Model D waiting like an old friend. As Jessica approached the piano, she could hear the expectant hush of 2,700 people settling into anticipation. But tonight was different from 6 months ago. Tonight she wasn't performing despite her circumstances. Tonight she was performing because of who she had always been. The conductor raised his baton, and Jessica felt the familiar thrill of collective breath held in anticipation. 2,700 people sat in absolute silence as the New York Philharmonic prepared to accompany her in Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 in C minor, one of the most demanding and emotionally complex pieces in the classical repertoire. Jessica's hands found the opening chords, and instantly the hall was transformed. The Rachmaninoff wasn't just music, it was autobiography in minor keys. A composer's struggle with depression and artistic doubt transformed into something transcendent. For Jessica, It was perfect. A piece that demanded both technical brilliance and emotional honesty, qualities she had spent 3 years learning to balance. The first movement's famous opening melody soared from the piano, supported by the orchestra's lush harmonies. Jessica's technique was flawless, but more than that, her interpretation carried weight earned through suffering. Every phrase spoke of resilience, of beauty discovered in darkness, of the refusal to surrender to despair. In the audience, Sarah Williams leaned forward, her critical mind cataloguing what she was witnessing. This wasn't just excellent playing, this was transcendent artistry, the kind of performance that reminded people why they had fallen in love with music in the first place. 3 rows behind Sarah, Christopher Anderson sat transfixed. He had come tonight unsure of his motivations, curiosity, guilt, perhaps a desire for closure. What he found instead was a revelation of what he had nearly destroyed. The woman on stage bore little resemblance to the frightened employee he had manipulated. This was Jessica Martinez as she was meant to be, powerful, confident, undeniable. The second movement brought tears to many eyes as Jessica's interpretation found new depths in Rachmaninoff's already emotional music. Her parents' sacrifice, her years of struggle, her moment of almost losing everything, all of it poured through her fingers into music that spoke of love, loss, and ultimate triumph. Helen Martinez gripped her program tightly, remembering the 8-year-old who had insisted that their old upright piano could make magic if you just touched the keys the right way. That child had been right, and the woman she had become was proving it to the world. The final movement erupted with joy and defiance, Jessica's hands flying across the keyboard with breathtaking virtuosity. The orchestra kept pace magnificently, but it was clear who was leading this musical conversation. As the piece built to its thunderous conclusion, the hall itself seemed to vibrate with the power of Jessica's playing. When the final chord rang out, the silence was absolute for a heartbeat that felt like eternity. Then Carnegie Hall erupted. 2,700 people rose as one, applauding with the kind of sustained enthusiasm usually reserved for legendary performances. The ovation continued for 7 minutes, an eternity in concert time, with calls of brava echoing from the balconies. But Jessica wasn't finished. As the applause began to settle, she remained at the piano, her hands poised over the keys. The conductor looked puzzled, then understanding dawned as she began to play. Renacimiento. The composition that had changed everything 6 months ago, now refined and deepened through months of professional development. The 4 movements, despair, endurance, recognition, liberation, told her story without words, transforming personal pain into universal truth. The audience listened with rapt attention as Jessica's music painted a sonic landscape of transformation. This was contemporary classical composition at its finest, accessible but sophisticated, emotional but intelligent, personal but universal. When Liberation reached its triumphant conclusion, the ovation was even more intense than before. Critics were already composing rave reviews in their heads, recording executives were calculating contract offers, and musicians were recognizing the arrival of a major new voice in classical music. As Jessica finally rose from the piano, accepting bouquet after bouquet of flowers, she caught sight of Christopher in the audience. He was applauding as enthusiastically as anyone, his face reflecting what looked like genuine pride mixed with something that might have been regret. Their eyes met across the vast hall, and Jessica saw in his expression an acknowledgement of what had been lost and what had been found. She nodded slightly, not forgiveness exactly, but recognition that his moment of cruelty had inadvertently led to this moment of triumph. As the curtain fell on her Carnegie Hall debut, Jessica knew that everything had changed, not just her career prospects or financial situation, but something deeper. She had reclaimed not just her artistry, but her sense of self-worth. The invisible woman was gone forever. In her place stood someone who would never again allow anyone to diminish her light. The post-concert reception at Lincoln Center was a whirlwind of congratulations, business cards, and champagne toasts. Jessica moved through the crowd with growing confidence, her earlier performance having transformed her from curiosity to sensation in the span of 90 minutes. Ms. Martinez, a distinguished man in his 50s, approached with obvious excitement. David Stern, A&R director for Deutsche Grammophon. I think we need to talk about recording opportunities. The Rachmaninoff was extraordinary, gushed a woman Jessica recognized as the artistic director of the London Symphony Orchestra. We'd love to discuss our upcoming season. Do you have management representation? The offers came in rapid succession: recording contracts, concert tours, composition commissions, master classes. Jessica felt simultaneously exhilarated and overwhelmed. 6 months ago, she'd been scrubbing toilets. Tonight, she was fielding offers from the world's most prestigious musical institutions. Sarah Williams appeared at her elbow with a knowing smile. Feeling popular? Feeling grateful, Jessica replied honestly. This world, I'd forgotten how welcoming it can be when you're seen as belonging here. You more than belong here, dear. You're going to reshape it. Sarah's eyes sparkled with professional satisfaction. That Renacimiento. Have you considered a full symphonic treatment? I think you could be looking at a major orchestral commission. Before Jessica could respond, Helen appeared with tears streaming down her face. Mija, I called your cousin Maria in Birmingham. Half the church is watching the live stream online. They're crying and cheering and calling you their miracle girl. The reminder of her roots grounded Jessica instantly. All the prestigious offers and artistic opportunities were wonderful, but they were built on a foundation laid by her parents in a modest Alabama home, nurtured by a community that had believed in her potential long before Manhattan's elite discovered her talent. Excuse me, Ms. Martinez. A young woman with a violin case approached hesitantly. I'm Elena Rodriguez, first year at Juilliard. I just wanted to say, your story gives me hope. I'm from a small town in New Mexico, and sometimes I feel like I don't belong here either. Jessica took the young woman's hands. You belong wherever your talent and dedication take you. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Would it be possible to study with you sometime? Your composition style, the way you blend classical technique with personal narrative. I'm not teaching yet, Jessica said gently, but when I am, you'll be my first student. As the reception continued, Jessica noticed Christopher standing alone near the windows overlooking Columbus Circle. He looked lost, out of place in a way that reminded her uncomfortably of her own early days working for him. Without quite knowing why, she approached him. Thank you for coming, she said simply. Christopher turned, his expression unreadable. Thank you for the invitation, though I'm not sure I deserved one. Maybe not, but you're here. I am. He stared out at the city lights. Jessica, what I did to you, keeping you trapped, using your desperation against you, I need you to know that I understand now how wrong it was. I know you do. How can you be so gracious about it? Jessica considered the question, watching the flow of people celebrating her triumph, people who 6 months ago wouldn't have known her name. Because holding on to anger would have trapped me just as surely as fear did. I chose freedom instead. Christopher nodded slowly. You've become someone extraordinary. You were always extraordinary, but now you know it. Now everyone knows it. That's the difference. Yes. He pulled out a small wrapped package. This is for you. A proper congratulations gift, not what I should have given you years ago, but what I can give you now. Jessica unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small leather-bound journal with her initials embossed in gold. Inside the front cover was an inscription, For the compositions yet to come, may you never again doubt your voice. C.A. It's beautiful, she said, genuinely touched. I hope you'll fill it with music that makes the world better. Like tonight did. As Christopher left, Dr. Vasquez approached with a small group of important-looking individuals. Jessica, there are some people I'd like you to meet, representatives from the National Endowment for the Arts. They have a proposition that I think will interest you. Jessica smiled, clutching her new journal. The night was young, her career was reborn, and her music had found its audience. But more importantly, she had found herself again. And this time, she would never let herself disappear. 1 year later, Jessica stood once again in the living room of Christopher Anderson's Manhattan penthouse, but this time the circumstances could not have been more different. She wore an elegant black cocktail dress instead of a grey uniform, held a champagne flute instead of a serving tray, and stood as an honored guest rather than invisible help. The occasion was Christopher's annual charity gala, this year benefiting the Jessica Martinez Foundation for underprivileged young musicians, an organization that provided scholarships, instruments, and mentorship to talented students from low-income families. The irony of the location wasn't lost on anyone, least of all the guest of honor herself. "Ladies and gentlemen," Christopher addressed the crowd of 200, many of the same faces who had witnessed Jessica's impromptu performance a year earlier. "Tonight we celebrate not just artistic excellence, but the power of second chances and the importance of recognizing talent wherever it may be found." Jessica listened from the side of the room, still amazed at how completely her life had transformed. The past 12 months had been a whirlwind. 3 album recordings, concert tours across Europe and Asia, a Pulitzer Prize nomination for Renacimiento, and most importantly, the foundation that was already changing lives. "Our honoree this evening," Christopher continued, "taught me one of the most valuable lessons of my life, that brilliance can be found in the most unexpected places, and that it's our responsibility to nurture it rather than exploit it." The audience applauded, many of them likely remembering their own complicity in the social dynamics that had kept Jessica invisible for so long. But Jessica had learned to focus on change rather than fault, progress rather than resentment. Please join me in welcoming Jessica Martinez. As Jessica approached the microphone, she caught sight of familiar faces scattered throughout the crowd. Sarah Williams, who had become not just a critic, but a friend. Dr. Vasquez, now serving on the foundation board. Helen, beaming with pride from the front row. And scattered throughout, scholarship recipients from the foundation. Young musicians who reminded Jessica daily why her success mattered beyond personal satisfaction. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Jessica began, her voice carrying easily through the room that had once witnessed her humiliation. "A year ago, I stood in this very spot and played music for people who saw me as entertainment rather than as an artist. Tonight I stand here as evidence that transformation is possible, not just for individuals, but for entire communities." She gestured toward the young musicians in the audience. These talented young people represent the future of classical music, but more than that, they represent the untapped potential that exists in every community, every economic level, every background. My story isn't unique because I faced adversity. It's unique because I was given a platform to overcome it. The room was absolutely silent, hanging on every word. The Jessica Martinez Foundation has already provided full scholarships to 12 students, instrument loans to over 50 families, and masterclasses in communities that have never had access to professional musical instruction. But our real achievement isn't measured in numbers, it's measured in dreams preserved, talents nurtured, and young people who will never have to choose between survival and artistry the way I did. Applause erupted, but Jessica raised her hand for silence. "I want to thank Christopher Anderson for hosting this event, and for something more important, for demonstrating that people can change, that mistakes can be acknowledged, and that redemption is possible when accompanied by genuine action." Christopher's eyes were bright with what might have been tears, his expression a mixture of gratitude and continued remorse. "But mostly," Jessica continued, "I want to thank everyone who believed in second chances, mine and others. Because talent without opportunity is just potential. Community without support is just wishful thinking, and change without action is just conversation." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces that represented New York's cultural and financial elite. "So tonight, as we celebrate what has been accomplished, I ask you to consider what still needs to be done. In every major city, in small towns across America, there are young people with extraordinary gifts who need what I was lucky enough to receive: recognition, support, and the chance to contribute their voices to our cultural conversation." The standing ovation was immediate and sustained, but Jessica wasn't finished. "I'd like to close with a brief performance, not of Chopin or Rachmaninoff this time, but of a piece written by Maria Santos, one of our scholarship recipients. She's 14 years old from the Bronx, and she wrote this about her dreams for the future." Jessica moved to the piano, the same Steinway that had been her resurrection, and now stood as a symbol of transformation rather than ornamentation. As her fingers found the keys, the room fell silent once more. The piece that emerged was young, hopeful, technically impressive, but emotionally direct. It spoke of dreams nurtured rather than deferred, of potential recognized rather than wasted, of a future where talent would be the only credential that mattered. When the music ended, Jessica stood and gestured toward a shy teenager near the back of the room. Maria Santos, ladies and gentlemen, the first scholarship recipient of the Jessica Martinez Foundation, and I predict, not the last young composer whose work you'll be hearing in venues like Carnegie Hall. As Maria stood and curtsied awkwardly, her face glowing with pride and possibility, Jessica felt the circle complete itself. This was why survival had been worth it, why the struggle had meaning, why second chances mattered. The applause that filled Christopher Anderson's living room wasn't just for Jessica or Maria, or even the foundation. It was for the possibility of a world where talent could flourish regardless of circumstances, where art could transcend social barriers, and where the invisible could become not just visible, but vital. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Jessica found herself alone with Christopher for a few moments. "Thank you," he said simply, "for giving me the chance to be part of something worthwhile." "Thank you," she replied, "for learning how to listen." And with that, Jessica Martinez, concert pianist, composer, advocate, and living proof that extraordinary can emerge from anywhere, stepped out into the Manhattan night, surrounded by young musicians whose dreams were just beginning, ready to write the next movement of a story that had started with survival and evolved into something like hope. 5 years after that transformative night in Christopher Anderson's penthouse, Jessica Martinez stood on the stage of the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., preparing for what would become known as the Concert of a Generation. The event marked the 5th anniversary of the Jessica Martinez Foundation and showcased 50 young musicians from across America, all scholarship recipients whose lives had been changed by the program. The auditorium buzzed with anticipation as an audience of 3,000 prepared to witness something unprecedented, a full symphonic presentation of Jessica's American Dream Suite, performed by Foundation alumni ranging in age from 14 to 22, representing every state in the Union and every conceivable background. In the audience sat an extraordinary gathering of witnesses to Jessica's journey. Helen Martinez, now 77 and serving as the Foundation's board chair, beamed from the front row beside Sarah Williams, whose book about Jessica's story had become a bestseller and catalyst for national conversations about systemic inequality in the arts. Dr. Vasquez was there, along with dozens of music educators, critics, and philanthropists who had been inspired by the Foundation's work to start similar programs in their own communities. Perhaps most remarkably, Christopher Anderson sat in the presidential box as the evening's primary sponsor, his transformation from exploiter to advocate having become almost as legendary as Jessica's rise from invisibility to international acclaim. His financial support had enabled the Foundation to expand nationwide, but more than that, his willingness to speak openly about his past mistakes had given others permission to examine their own complicity in systemic exclusion. "Ladies and gentlemen," the evening's host announced, "please welcome Jessica Martinez." As Jessica approached the conductor's podium, she would be leading tonight's performance herself. The audience rose in spontaneous ovation. But their applause wasn't just for her. It was for what she represented. Proof that talent and determination could overcome any obstacle, that second chances could reshape not just individual lives, but entire communities. "Thank you," Jessica said as the applause settled. 5 years ago I was a woman who had given up on her dreams, convinced that circumstances had made them impossible. Tonight, I stand before you not as someone who overcame adversity, but as someone who learned that adversity overcome becomes a bridge for others to cross. She gestured toward the young musicians taking their places on stage, a diverse assembly that reflected America's true face rather than its traditional artistic elite. These extraordinary young people represent more than individual success stories. They represent a fundamental shift in how we think about talent, opportunity, and who gets to contribute to our cultural conversation. Each of them faced obstacles that might have ended their musical journeys before they truly began. Instead, they're here tonight to show us what's possible when we invest in potential rather than privilege. As the orchestra tuned their instruments, Jessica caught sight of Maria Santos, now 19 and principal violinist, whose composition had marked the beginning of the Foundation's public presence. Beside her sat David Kim from rural Oregon, whose parents had worked 3 jobs to afford violin lessons until the Foundation stepped in. In the brass section was Aaliyah Johnson from Detroit, whose high school had eliminated its music program until foundation grants restored it. American Dreams Suite, Jessica continued, tells the story of our nation through the voices of those who have traditionally been excluded from telling it. Tonight, you'll hear the dreams of immigrants, the aspirations of rural communities, the hopes of urban neighborhoods, and the universal human desire to create something beautiful in a world that often seems determined to prevent beauty from emerging. She raised her conductor's baton, and 3,000 people held their breath. The suite began with Origins, musical portraits of the young performers' backgrounds, from Appalachian folk traditions to urban hip-hop influences, from classical Mexican mariachi to contemporary R&B. Jessica had woven these diverse musical languages into a sophisticated symphonic tapestry that honored each tradition while creating something entirely new. The second movement, Obstacles, painted a sonic landscape of the barriers these young musicians had faced: poverty rendered in minor keys, discrimination captured in discordant harmonies, despair expressed through fragmented melodies that fought to maintain coherence against overwhelming odds. But it was the third movement, Community, that brought many audience members to tears. As the music swelled with themes of mutual support, mentorship, and collective growth, the visual impact was undeniable. 50 young people from every conceivable background united in the creation of something greater than any of them could achieve alone. The final movement, Transformation, erupted with joy and possibility. Every musical tradition represented on stage contributed to a celebration of what America could become when it truly embraced all its talents. The music soared with hope, defiance, and an unshakable belief in the power of opportunity to change everything. When the final note rang out, the silence lasted for what felt like eternity. Then the Kennedy Center exploded in the longest standing ovation in its history, 14 minutes of sustained applause that acknowledged not just an extraordinary performance, but a fundamental shift in how America thought about artistic excellence. As the young musicians took their bows, Jessica stepped aside, making them the focus of attention. These were the real stars tonight, the living proof that her story hadn't been an anomaly, but a preview of what was possible when barriers were removed and support was provided. Later, at the reception, Jessica found herself surrounded by foundation supporters, government officials, and most importantly, parents whose children had been transformed by the opportunities the program provided. "Ms. Martinez," a tearful mother approached. "My daughter Maria, you remember her, the violinist from tonight. She told me something yesterday that I wanted to share with you. She said, 'Mama, because of Ms. Martinez, I know that being different isn't being less. It's being necessary.'" Those words captured everything Jessica had hoped to achieve. Not just individual success, but a fundamental change in how young people saw themselves and their potential. As the evening wound down, Christopher Anderson approached for their now annual moment of reflection. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. Jessica considered the question, looking out at the young musicians still celebrating their triumph, their faces glowing with the confidence of young people who knew they belonged wherever their talents could take them. "Only one," she said finally, "that it took so long." "And what happens next?" Jessica smiled, thinking of the international expansion plans, the new programs in development, the legislation pending in Congress to support arts education in underserved communities. "Next, we make sure that no young person with extraordinary talent ever has to choose between survival and artistry again. Next, we change what's possible." As they spoke, Maria Santos approached with her violin case, her face still flushed with performance adrenaline. "Ms. Martinez," she said, "I wanted you to know I've been accepted to the Vienna Conservatory with a full scholarship. I'll be studying composition and performance." "That's wonderful, Maria. Your parents must be so proud." "They are. But I told them something else too. I told them that when I graduate, I'm coming back. I want to teach in the foundation programs, help other kids the way you helped me." Jessica felt tears threatening as she recognized her own story coming full circle, not ending but expanding, becoming part of a movement that would outlast any individual career. "The foundation will be lucky to have you," she said. As the last guests departed and the Kennedy Center emptied, Jessica stood alone on the stage where her American Dream Suite had premiered. In the silence, She could almost hear the echoes of music yet to be written, voices yet to be discovered, dreams yet to be realized. 5 years ago, she had been a woman who cleaned other people's houses while her own dreams gathered dust. Tonight, she was a catalyst for thousands of dreams, a bridge between what was and what could be, living proof that extraordinary can emerge from anywhere when opportunity meets determination. The invisible woman was gone forever. In her place stood someone who had learned that the greatest performances aren't always on stage. Sometimes they're in the quiet moments when you choose to lift others up, when you transform personal triumph into collective possibility, when you ensure that the light that lifted you becomes a beacon for others to follow. As Jessica turned off the stage lights and walked toward the exit, she carried with her the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new young musicians whose stories were just beginning. And she was ready for all of it. After all, she had learned that the most beautiful music comes not from perfect circumstances, but from imperfect people determined to create something better than what they found. The symphony continued and Jessica Martinez was finally home.